Welcome to the Greater Culture Podcast, where movement, mindset, and mastery meet. Join us as we explore the art of living fully with expert guests and real-life stories to inspire your journey. And welcome to another episode of the Greater Culture Podcast with your host, Brad Marshall. And today, really excited to be joined by Greg Everett of Catalyst Athletics, somebody who's been in the Olympic weightlifting space for a number of years, has created some incredible resources from different books to videos, and has helped a lot of coaches and athletes figure out the sport of Olympic weightlifting and get a little bit more proficient at it. And so, Greg, thanks so much for taking some time to jump on the podcast with me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And so I always am really fascinated by what gets people started or into the field that they're in. And so as someone who's been around the Olympic weightlifting community, what does your origin story look like of how did you get into this world?
It's I laugh because I get asked that all the time, and I never have a good answer. And I think about all these people who are like, yeah, since I was 4 years old, I wanted to be a firefighter or a baseball player. I'm like, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I'm 45. I still don't really know. So in all honesty, it was a very organic sort of thing where I've never had like a really clear end goal in terms of what I wanted to do career-wise, even like a lot of the specifics of life. You listen to a guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he's like, I could perfectly visualize every single goal I've had in life. And I was like, well, what's that like? I don't even think about it. And so fortunately for me, that what I do instead is I kind of have this desire to accumulate experiences, right? And try new things and interact with people I wouldn't normally meet or speak to. And to me, that's an opportunity to learn what's out there, because you can sit on your couch and try to visualize your goals, but how do you know what to visualize if you haven't experienced these things yet to understand how you feel about them and whether or not they're meaningful to you? So am I going to spend 10 years visualizing a goal and then achieve it and be like, well, actually, I don't really enjoy doing this. This is kind of dumb. I wish I had not even started. So, I'm a fly by the seat of my pants sort of guy when it comes to that sort of thing. And so I just got really lucky. And I've said that a lot over the years. I've been really fortunate to have kind of been in the right place at the right time and met these really kind of the perfect people at these pivotal points in my life. Rob Wolf is a good example. I met him when I was, I think, in my third college. Maybe I was still in my second one. I don't remember. And he asked me to partner in his gym, and that was like the fourth CrossFit affiliate of all time. And so it was things like that where I was constantly kind of stumbling into these really convenient accidental situations. And the one thing I'll take credit for is recognizing good opportunities and jumping on them, right? Not letting them pass because I didn't want to take risks or whatever the case was. And so I think it was is very little, if any, planning and foresight, and more that willingness and eagerness to take advantage of the opportunities that came my way while I was out there trying to explore, what was possible and what was interesting to me.
Yeah, I think that ability to say yes to just new experiences, new opportunities, it sounds great. And I think it's something we all aspire to. As you were in those early days of dabbling and jumping into different experiences, what were some of the things that you were testing out or trying or testing the waters of, if you will, that started to figure out, oh, here's some areas I really enjoy or some things I like doing, and maybe here's some things that aren't for me?
Yeah, and so the fitness / strength training / weightlifting thing, that's always been present in some form for as long as I can remember. I mean, I'm like being a little kid, like 7, 8, and working out. Finding whether it was just calisthenics or building ridiculous contraptions in my garage to lift weights. There was always something like that going on, and I played every sport you can think of at some point, and plus all the weird ones. I rode bike trials competitively for a while. I was a rock climber, all the obscure ones, along with all the classic, American boy team sports. The team sports never really appealed to me that much. I'm glad I did them because it's a good experience for a lot of reasons, but the sports themselves and I honestly, being on that sort of a team, I was never really that into it. I definitely like the individual sports better. And I think that's one of the reasons I like weightlifting in that sense, is because it's an individual sport, but you can do it as part of a team. So you can kind of have the best of both worlds in that way. But, ultimately you are the one who is responsible for the outcome versus like, 7, 9, 10, whatever teammates who are literally or figuratively dropping the ball, and then you pay the price, or vice versa, right? You don't have that sense of responsibility, like, I'm the guy who blew it for everybody else, and now they're going to beat me up in the parking lot after the game. But it was so that the part of all of those sports that appealed to me most was the training, the preparation for them, right? That was the common thread for me is, doing this stuff is kind of interesting and it's kind of fun. But like it was always, my focus was kind of more on, what do I do to get better? What do I do outside of this activity to make me better at this activity? And so again, Olympic weightlifting, that's a very natural place to end up, because the preparation for the sport is pretty much the sport, right? Of course, there's a lot more types of training you're doing for only 2 competition lifts, but it's weightlifting, right? You're still in the gym training, and that's essentially what you're replicating then in competition. So that just seemed kind of natural to me. But I mean, I worked on an ambulance. I worked in multiple bike shops throughout my life. God, I mean, I taught a writing class in college one semester. That was awful. So it's like, dabbled. I was what do you call it, a dilettante for a while, kind of trying to figure these things out, and just none of them appealed to me enough for a long enough period of time to stick with it. I mean, thank God I shouldn't be still working at a bike shop at this point in my life, but
It's fun to hear the kind of interaction between finding different things that excite you and get you passionate, and then mixing that in with what keeps you going and keeps you engaged over the long haul. And it's interesting you mentioned that you were drawn to the training aspect of all the different sports compared to the experiences you get on the field. And I think, in the world we live in now, it's so outcome focused. If we want to achieve a certain total or a podium, or I'm working to lose X amount of pounds, that people don't necessarily fall in love with the process. So what was it about the process that you were falling in love with and really enjoyed?
That's a good question. So just to take a step back, you say, well, everybody is so outcome focused in these days, which is very true. And at the same time, also, most people are miserable. And I'm not saying there's necessarily a cause and effect, but I kind of think there's a cause and effect there. When you look at an outcome focus, the outcome is one brief solitary moment in time, right? You win the game, you get the job, the girl says yes, whatever it is, done, over, right? You spent all this time working towards this one thing. It's this like very brief, ephemeral thing. And now what? Right? Whereas a process is potentially infinite, right? So whether it's a sport, whether it's a hobby, whether it's a career, if you are focused on the process and you enjoy that process, then that is something that you can enjoy indefinitely, right? Doesn't mean you're going to enjoy it every moment, during the course of your life. There's going to be plenty of times, like I have with weightlifting, as a weightlifter, as a coach, as a business owner, that are genuinely miserable, and you're just like, God, why am I doing this to myself? But like I tell my lifters, you don't have to love it all the time. You just have to love it on average more than you hate it, right? You just have to have that net love balance. And so again, I think, to me, I don't know that was ever a conscious choice, like I'm going to be more process focused than outcome focused. I think, again, I got lucky, and that was kind of my natural constitution. That was more what made sense to me. And I don't know, maybe it's because growing up, I didn't necessarily have a lot of really amazing outcomes. So I was like, why would I focus on that? But the process to me was always this sort of process of exploration and learning, and these sort of like micro achievements, right? So that's another way to look at it too, is outcome focus is one big achievement. Process focus is a whole bunch of little achievements, just over and over and over and over again. So even if you're talking about something like weightlifting, where I want to get this total, well, if you're 20 kilos off, that's 20 little PRs, 20 little achievements you can make along the way. And so if you can have that mindset, you are going to squeeze a lot more out of enjoyment out of any given period of time than if your only or primary overwhelming focus is the end, right? And it's the end. Listen, it even sounds bad.
Yeah. It's one of those quotes I feel like I've heard time and time again where it's like the man who loves the journey will go further than the man who simply is worried about the destination. And I think it rings true for so many folks out there. Did you have coaches or leaders in your life who helped orient you that way as you were growing up and trying all these different things and kind of got you focused on the process? Or like you said, was it more of just this innate sort of approach that you found worked for you?
I do think it was at least partly innate. And I can, again, I feel like I'm failing when people ask me these questions because I never have the answer. Like, what's the book that changed your mindset? I'm like, I can't think of a single one. Or who is the influence? I'm like, I don't know. No one that comes to mind. So it's like, and I hate saying that too, because I think some people will hear that and they go, oh, this guy thinks he had it all figured out himself. And I'm not claiming that by any means. What I'm saying is that the way I arrive at things has just been a process, and certainly there are influences from other people, but they're small, right? It's a lot of little minor influences that then sort of aggregate into the final form, right? Or they kind of push me in that direction, or however you want to think of it. And so when someone says, what was the influence or a major influence? I don't know. I can't think of it. And I try. I really genuinely try. I'm like, well, what about this coach? And I'm like, well, no, he just kind of taught me how to do push-ups better. It's like that wasn't really like life guidance for me. And even like like someone like my dad, I hear these stories where like, oh, my dad just gave me those great life lessons. Mine just kind of like expected me to figure things out on my own. And maybe he did that because he saw I was doing it, but it didn't look like I was doing it for a long period of time in my misguided youth. So I don't know if that was it, but I totally forgot what the original question was, but that gives you an idea of how I get through life. It's basically just accidents and luck and good fortune.
Yeah, I always love hearing people's perspective and orientation and how they think about the world themselves and how they operate within them. And I think, yeah, like you said, some people have strong influences and people, some are more based on the environment they find themselves in, some are a combination of the two, and there's no right or wrong there. So as you're dabbling and trying things out, sooner or later you got into weightlifting. And what was it about weightlifting that led you to say, hey, I really actually enjoy this and I want to figure it out and see if I can solve, whether for self or others, what that was like?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a lot of pieces that came together over time. And I think, like any, boy of my generation, you are kind of pushed towards the bodybuilding sort of approach, right? That's what's in the media, that's what's in the gyms, that's just what you're exposed to. My high school weight room, for example, was a tiny little room between the two sides of the basketball gym, no platforms. There was one power rack, no one used it. It was like a universal machine and some weird cable stack stuff. And so like I wasn't exposed to that. And for years and years, I learned the hard way that I was never going to be a bodybuilder. I have a disease where it's like I can't build muscle, right? So it doesn't. I was like, what's the point of this? I would keep trying, right? Because I was a skinny, short kid, and so I had that bit of a chip on my shoulder in that sense. But so when I figured out there was a thing, Olympic weightlifting, where it was a sport and it was not about aesthetics. I didn't have to get big arms. I did have to wear tights. That was kind of lame, but it was athletic, and it incorporated so many different physical traits of athleticism, mobility, which I was definitely lucky to be pretty mobile always my whole life. Not to say I didn't work on it, but the speed, the balance, all these different things that you don't typically see in a strength sport like powerlifting, for example. I mean, I'm not saying this to diminish the sport of powerlifting, but I don't look at that as a great display of athleticism. It's very focused on like a limited number of traits and abilities. Um, for in the same way that some sports are very skill dependent and not physical ability dependent, right? So like if you are an incredible dart thrower, you have amazing skill, but are we saying it's athletic? No, of course not. So I see powerlifting as kind of like the inverse of that. And again, I'm not trying to beat up on powerlifters, just the first example that comes to mind. But that's why weightlifting stood out to me, because didn't have to look good. We gave up on that, early on in life. And I could do something, get better at it. It was this difficult, challenging process that required a lot of sort of intellectual work along with the physical work, because you got to figure it out, right? Especially, people forget now, but there didn't used to be an internet, right? You had to like read books, and maybe hope you bumped into an Olympic weightlifting coach, which I never did. I found out 20 years later that I lived 45 minutes away from Jim Schmitz, who's like the most decorated Olympic weightlifting coach in America. But how would I know that? I'm not going to pick up a phone book from South San Francisco when I live 45 minutes away. So I think it was all those things coming together. It kind of like it suited me for the abilities I had, the abilities I didn't have and would never have, and then that desire to have that broad kind of universal challenge of both the physical and mental aspects.
Yeah. And how did you go about finding Olympic weightlifting then? Because I think nowadays, like, I found out about it through CrossFit, but if you had asked me what is Olympic weightlifting, I'm not even sure I could have told you before I walked into a
Right.
gym and saw people moving a barbell in that way. And you mentioned that in your high school, very limited equipment, very limited coaching there. So the idea of even stumbling into this type of Olympic sport, how did you stumble into it, if that's the way you think about it?
I forget the first thing I saw, but one of the very early ones I remember was Charles Poliquin's old book, Poliquin Principles, which I think came out in like the early to mid 90s, if not a little bit before that. But I remember distinctly to this day, there was a photo of one of the Air Force weightlifting team guys cleaning. And I was like, what's that? And it kind of talked about it. And again, I was like, well, here's this guy. He's not a bodybuilder. He looks like me if I were to wear tights and, put a bar on my shoulders. And so it was like things like that, where it's like you'd catch these little glimpses of it and you'd have to try to piece it together, because they weren't televising Olympic weightlifting at that point in my childhood that I know of. Like the ABC Wide World of Sports was not doing it anymore. I think once it got to the 90s, I think they stopped in the 80s. So I just wasn't exposed to it. I had to kind of piece it together. And so initially, once I knew, okay, there's snatch, clean, jerk, I kind of saw them as like bench, squat, deadlift. Like they were just other barbell lifts. I didn't really truly get the sport of it, because again, I had never seen it. I didn't really know what it was. And so I taught myself the lifts to whatever extent that I was capable of based on still photos. You know what I mean? Like even when I got more serious about it, you barely could find video. So you certainly couldn't find it on the USA weightlifting website. God forbid they show you what the sport is. And so I got by, and then it was just whatever, not a big deal. And then I started getting more serious once I met Rob Wolf, and he had a gym with rubber on the floor and bumper plates. And I didn't say the bars spun well, but they spun a little bit. And so I was like, oh, this is my chance now to like see if I can pursue this more seriously. So again, it's one of those things where completely, by chance, my neighbor was a sheriff's deputy who did Brazilian jiu-jitsu with the guy that Rob had opened this little gym with recently, and said, hey, these guys need a website. They're willing to trade for training. And that was another thing I was doing, is supporting myself partly by doing website design at that time. I was like, yeah, okay, I'll check it out. And I wasn't, I did BJJ for a while, but I was never that interested in it. But, that's how I met Rob. And then he was doing this weird stuff. There was a climbing rope and pull-up bars and barbells. And I was like, well, I'm into this. And we were out there like lunatics running barefoot on the asphalt and stuff. It was an interesting era back then in the early 2000s. Anyway, that's how I eventually came to it. Again, it was this like long process, because I couldn't just type up what is this thing, Olympic weightlifting? Where do I do it? Show me some short films and tell me everything I need to know in 30 seconds with an AI overview, or that we can do now. So it was I sound like a grandparent, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm curious, at that stage of finding the sport and kind of learning it on your own, what would you say your relationship was like with, the sport? Because as some people, if they come to find CrossFit or high rocks or powerlifting, some are like, oh, this is my hobby. I just like doing it after work and throwing around some weight for a little bit. And other people are like, oh, I'm going all in on this thing and I want to learn, I want to grow, I want to spend a lot of time in the gym. What was it like in those early days for you? Was it that passionate where you were like, I really want to solve this problem and figure it out? Or was it just kind of a hobby that morphed into something more?
It was pretty passionate right out of the gate. Once I figured it out, in my mid 20s, I finally had the opportunity. I think the sport itself was very appealing to me, and I had what I felt enough potential in the sport. Like I naturally picked the stuff up well. I had the mobility. I was reasonably quick. I was strong enough, at that point. Like I think the second time I actually tried snatching, I could snatch body weight. And so it was like things like that. I was like, oh, well, maybe there's some hope for me. I should pursue this. And so I actually sold my share of the gym back to Rob and Nikki, his wife. Bought them out of the performance menu journal that we published. We basically traded between the two. I moved down to Southern California to train with Mike Bergner because I was like, well, I'm not getting any younger. I'm already kind of a little old to be beginning this seriously, so I better not waste any time. So yeah, I was all in, and luckily it worked out, because otherwise that would have been a really dumb decision on my part. Luckily there was a career that came out of it, other than, once the athletic side of things didn't pan out anymore because I was too old and broke myself.
Did you start to see a career that could take shape from this? Or when did that process come about? Because I think that's similar to other people's journeys of, you get really passionate about this skill, hobby, whatever, and you're like, this is what I do as like outside of my thing that pays the bills. But for you, it sounds like there was maybe some vision of like, oh, I really like doing this thing. I'm passionate about it. Oh, and there's a way I can actually make it into a career or something that pays my bills. When did that sort of process happen for you? Pretty early on when you sold the gym, or later on?
It was pretty early, but only because I was already supporting myself doing that sort of thing, right? Like I was coming from owning a gym, running this fitness, related journal. And then when I moved to Southern California, I was running the journal. That was a big source of my income. And then I was, doing private training clients. Like I had a kickboxing dude, and I had some like normal fitness people, just training him out of Mike Bergner's garage, and he refused to take any money from me. He was very generous those years. So it wasn't like, oh, I can turn Olympic weightlifting into a business, because at that point I was focused on being an athlete. I just wanted to be a weightlifter. I wasn't trying to coach. I was trying to, wring every last bit of athletic potential I had out of my skinny little legs and my rapidly increasing age. But it was a very natural progression, though, because people were coming in and out of that gym, and they would start asking me questions. They would start asking me for help. And I just found I was able to do a good job with that. And Bergner was supportive of it. And at some point I said to Bergner, I was like, you need to get a book out. There's nothing good out there. I will ghostwrite an entire book for you. I just need to sit down with you for a couple hours and get some information, whatever. And I wrote this entire book, short of like the program design section. And I was like, hey, we got to sit down. We got to talk about this stuff. And at that point, he was kind of like, I don't really think I want to do a book. And I was like, oh boy, okay. Well, I'm going to do a book, right? I have no business writing a book on Olympic weightlifting at this point. But the way I looked at it was, there was a really big need. There was a big hole for someone like me, a kid, say I'm 14, 15, 16 years old. I want to learn Olympic weightlifting. There was Tommy Kono's book. There was Artie Dreschler's book. I think there was like one other, and I'm blanking on the guy's name, whatever. You know what I'm saying? And I remember seeing those books and be like, okay, how do I do a snatch? So, with all due respect to those guys, because I do respect Harvey Newton, I do respect them absolutely, and they have this vast amount of knowledge, but the books they wrote did not teach you how to do the snatch and clean and jerk, which to me was like the most obvious things. Like, I don't have a coach. I don't happen to live next door to you, right? Where I can just come to your garage and you can show me. Like, I need you to show me this stuff. And so basically I said, well, I'm going to write the book I wish I had when I was a kid with no coach, no other resources. And I'm going to cover every single thing from how you tape your thumbs to how you write training programs. And that's what I did. And so it was bold would be the generous term for it. Misguided would probably be more accurate, but it ended up working out great because there was such a need for it, right? And luckily, as I was writing and as that first edition was getting out there and getting popular, I was doing more and more coaching, and I was learning at what felt like a quick rate. And so I was able to keep updating that stuff well. And so now that thing's in its third edition. I'm way overdue on the fourth, but I swear I'm working on it. By working on it, I mean I have some notes. And so it's like it worked out really well, but that wasn't my plan. Like, I didn't move down to train with Bergner and be like, okay, I'm going to apprentice with this coach, and then I'm going to become a coach, and then I'm going to start a business that does, educational material for Olympic weightlifting, and I'm going to be the greatest content creator of all time in this sport. It was kind of like, oh man, I can't believe I'm getting away with this. Like, people actually will give me a few bucks for this book. I should probably, do this more, because otherwise I'm working at a bike shop. And I did have a lot of fun working at a bike shop, putting egg rolls down people's seat tubes and stuff like that. But at some point you got to move on.
Yeah, I love seeing the threads here of just how continuing to see a need, say yes to experiences and opportunities, and essentially just seeing where it takes you. I'm imagining the process of writing a book, of trying to articulate one of the most complex movements you can do, I think, when it comes to fitness, probably gave you such a depth of knowledge, because it's one thing to see it, it's another thing to do it, but to actually have to teach somebody how to do the move and then articulate it in just words, that sounds like such a complicated process for two complicated movements. What was that journey like of writing the book of from A to Z? How do you do everything for the snatch, the clean, and the jerk?
Yeah, it is. You're 100% right. Like, you don't truly understand something until you've been forced to explain it successfully to somebody else. And I can tell you there were a lot of nights in my little dark apartment kitchen, because it was half underground, messing around with a PVC pipe, figuring out a teaching progression for a lift, or, how do I describe this really specific position in a way that's, obvious. And again, like, explaining movement and even positions in words without video is incredibly difficult, right? That's why no one reads articles or books anymore. Oh, I can just watch this video. And so it's a really difficult medium to work with in that sense. But again, I think it does force you to really think through things and to be able to imagine someone else reading that and how they're going to process it. And so that was like, that's one of the big things that's changed over the years with the different edition of the books, or the way I teach or explain things, is that I've gotten years and years and years of feedback, not necessarily intentional. Like, people are not saying, oh, I read this and this is what I thought, but I see what happens. I see, like, I said it that way, and now I see a bunch of people who are doing this, and that's not what I intended. So I better change that and figure out a better way to explain it. And so that process was kind of happening on a micro scale while I was writing that book. And it was a scary thing too, because as a writer, which I had been writing years before I did that book, which is why I felt I was suited to do it. But I'm not the kind of writer who's like handing out drafts to people like, oh, give me your notes. I'm like, nope. You can see it when everyone else sees it, when it's in publication. And if you don't like it, that's too bad, because that's what I wanted. I don't care what you wanted from my book. This is what I wanted. And so, but then here I am, this young new guy. Here's a book, which is the realm of a subject matter expert. And Fortunately, I didn't do a terrible job. And, a lot of the really successful coaches out there at that time were incredibly supportive. Of course, Bergner, but, Jim Schmitz, John Thrush, Bob Takano, all these guys who were kind of like the big names when I was getting into the sport were really supportive. And not a single one of them was like, who do you think you are? Why are you writing this book? I should be writing this book. They were all like, man, this is awesome. This is exactly how I do things. I remember Glenn Penley at one point, the late Glenn Penley, was talking to my wife, Amy, and he asked her something like, how does he know this stuff? And she was like, I don't really know. I was like, well, what do you mean? How do I know it? It's the same way anyone knows anything. Like, you figure it out one way or another. So that was always interesting to me. And he didn't mean it like in a negative way. It was like, how did he figure this out with relatively little experience? And I think that's luckily, again, one of the skills I just happen to have is I tend to assimilate information pretty quickly. And to me, I should say that not in every arena, but like for weightlifting specifically, it was something that came naturally to me. Like, I felt like I understood it, what was happening, what needed to be happened, what the effects of certain things were, and how this motion and position will influence this next thing. And so I think I just got really lucky like that. It just worked with how my brain worked. And so I got away with doing something really early on that you shouldn't normally do. And again, I don't remember what the question was, but hopefully that was somewhat useful or at least entertaining.
What I really love is hearing the thought process and the vulnerability around, I'm going to put my thoughts and my opinions and everything I've learned on paper, and we'll see what happens. I almost liken it to that was like your PhD of Olympic weightlifting, is like, I'm in the lab testing, figuring out how does this make sense to me. And then you releasing that book to the public was almost like defending your dissertation of like, here's where I stand. And
Yeah.
everybody's feedback gave you the confidence then to say like, I think I know what I'm doing here. And I think I can keep doing this.
And it was, fortunately at that time, it was so early on in this kind of journey into doing what I do now that had I put that book out and it just, everyone was like, this is terrible, you're an idiot, it would have been humiliating. But I was not so far down that road that I couldn't have made an abrupt turn and done something else. If I put out a book now and people were like, oh my God, this is bad, I would be devastated. Like, I don't know what I would do, because what else am I going to do with my life at this point? Like, get a new job? I'm not going to get a new job. This is what I'm doing until I retire. I hope that's what I'm going to try to do. So it's like, it was fortunate in that sense where I could like, I could, it was easier, I think, to take that risk in at least a financial and career sense. Maybe not like the ego part of it. Like you said, the vulnerability is like, oh God, here we go. So yeah, again, fortunately, it worked out really well. And there's always going to be detractors out there. And I remember when I was early on, I was stupid enough to like read Amazon reviews, and there were a couple nasty ones right out of the gate, and I was like, who is this guy? Like, it's the same thing you get now, like on YouTube, where you'll get some like nasty big comment, like explaining the sport of weightlifting to you. You're like, based on what? Like, you watch other people's YouTube videos? Like, that's your entire education. Just sit down. Anyway, that's a different subject.
No, it's funny how you mentioned that, of just like, you get so involved in the thing that you love and the thing that you know, and you just are sharing your thoughts and opinions and how everybody wants to jump on it with their own of how you're wrong. Everybody's poking holes in systems. So along the way of this book writing and then releasing it, was there a switch where you started to realize, okay, as athlete, maybe my competitive days are numbered. I actually really love the coaching aspect, and I'm interested in pursuing that more. And what did that transition look like? Because I think sometimes people who are really good at the thing aren't always great coaches at the thing, but you, like you said, were able to pick up nuances and be able to articulate what you were experiencing and help others do that. So how did that sort of transition happen from athlete to book writer to coach?
I mean, it was pretty natural, because I was definitely not destined to be a great weightlifter. I like Bob Takano said in the American weightlifting documentary I put out years ago. He had like the greatest quote. He's like, I was the best of the not so good weightlifters, right? So it was like, in his kind of like regional weightlifting community, like he was the guy. And like that's kind of how I was. Like, yeah, I'm pretty good. As long as we don't look outside, this of general vicinity here. And so it was natural then to transition into coaching. But I got into it as an athlete. Started taking it seriously too late. So it's like I knew the lifts, I taught myself, so I had that like 10 or so years of kind of knowing how to snatch and clean and jerk, but never doing anything with it. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh man, time's running out, gotta go. And so I had a decent run between until I was 34 and so or 35. So I I think it was like March. I did my first Masters National Championships, won it, broke the American record clean and jerk, and then went back to senior nationals like 2-3 months later and blew my shoulder out and ended up ending my career. So it was like it was an abrupt end. And I was still getting better at that age. It's just that I had this like freak accident, and then a major injury, major surgery, a year of rehab. And during that rehab, my wife and I moved out of state, like completely changed our business. Like there was just too much going on. But so for several years, I was competing, a national championship level competition and coaching a full team. So that was basically end of 2008 until 2015, where I was juggling both, which it did not make it easy as an athlete. If you're a good coach and you're still competing, you're going to prioritize your athletes. Like Phil Sabatini is a great example of it, where he was this phenomenal weightlifter who finally just retired. I think he and I did our first American Open together 100 years ago. And I mean, he was still going until like this last national. Was unbelievable. But he's out there coaching every time too. So he was like one of the few guys I knew who was also doing it. And he was just a better weightlifter than me. We called him Guns McPherson. The guy was jacked. But so the transition was natural in the sense that I knew from fairly early on, like I'm not going to make an Olympic team. I'm not going to go to the World Championships. I can be kind of like rubbing elbows with the top guys at the nationals level, but it's not going beyond that. And that was disappointing to me, but it was also, I was kind of resigned to it very quickly. Like, I get it. It's not that big of a deal. I'm not going to cry about it. But I do like coaching. There are opportunities here. I shouldn't say it. Weren't really opportunities. We're kind of trying to make the opportunities at that point. And luckily that worked out again, like just kind of pushing, like I don't really want to do anything else. So let's see if I can make this work. And the landscape got better and better, largely the influence of CrossFit over the years and bringing a larger and larger audience who was then interested in these things and, had disposable income and all these things that are necessary to be able to make a career on what is ultimately a hobby for most people. So yeah, it's just, again, all these things kind of falling into place when they needed to, or at least close enough to when they needed to.
Yeah. And one of the things I feel like we see now as well is when somebody gets into a certain space and they experience success, they then create a brand. And because of their success, it draws other people towards them to, hey, let me teach you about this thing that I've experienced some success with. Is that how the brand for Catalyst kind of came about? Because you were in the space lifting, people saw you, they realized, hey, he's got some success, he knows what he's talking about, I'm going to go affiliate with his camp or with his team? Or how did you go about thinking about building a brand that you would have people who want to come work with you, potentially move or whatever it is, to come train and learn from you?
Well, Catalyst Athletics actually started, that was just an LLC for my personal training business when I was in Southern California. That's why it's called Catalyst Athletics and not like Everett weightlifting or something, because that just wasn't a thing. Like you couldn't make money in Olympic weightlifting in 2006. It just didn't exist. Like the top coaches were high school teachers and, things like that. They were running their programs out of rec departments. They weren't running commercial gyms and these big programs like we see now. So it was, again, I had already been doing that stuff with Rob Wolf, through the Performance Menu Journal. We were creating content, and that always appealed to me. Like I like that teaching side of things. And especially back then when I could write it, which was a lot easier than making videos. I can bang out an article in 15 minutes. Video, I'm like over here for hours to make a 38-second video, and people still don't watch the whole thing. So it was seeing like the success of the book, and I was like, oh, put out some instructional posters, and so it was this kind of natural thing where you get some momentum, and then you recognize, hey, I can build on this. And I was fortunate enough to be doing this at a time where there was not much competition. Like no one else was really doing this stuff at that time. Bud Charnica was putting out some articles here and there. He was doing all these translations of the old like Soviet manuals, weightlifting manuals, but it was like really inaccessible stuff. And it, again, it's not helpful for beginners or even intermediates. And so there was a hole in the market. I had the peculiar combination of abilities to kind of fill it. And so people kept getting stuff from me, and so I kept making more. And I was reluctant, like, switching over and kind of transitioning more into video and stuff. Like if you watch or listen to my early videos, like they're bad. The content is good, but like the presentation is just bad. And I'm kind of slowly working my way through redoing those, but it's because I didn't want to be on camera. I hated talking into a microphone. It was not something that was like naturally comfortable for me. And so I've gotten past that to a large degree now, where I'm like, I just don't even care at this point. I'm going to just do this. And if people like it, great. If they don't, they can tell me I'm a loser on YouTube. They do anyway. So whatever. And so I'm really short on sleep. I don't know if you can tell. My answers just meander off into somewhere, and then I just stop. Like now, I don't even know what we're talking about anymore.
What I absolutely love is it gives us a glimpse into kind of how your mind works, and I appreciate
sometimes not, yeah,
sometimes not, sometimes on, but yeah, I see the creativity and how that just like fires up and gets you going down one train, and then you figure out a way to bring it all together, especially for the athletes that you're working with. And one of the questions I always find really fascinating, and this probably stems from some of the CrossFit side, is when you start thinking about movement, clean and jerk, snatch, there's a science to it of there's levers and there's certain ways that we want to move the force. And then there's also an art to it where you're like, that guy doesn't move like that guy, but he's still moving a lot of weight. In your years of coaching, do you find yourself on one sort of side than the other, or is it a blend of the two? Like, do you think of weightlifting as very scientific and there's specific positions and we need to achieve those, or is it an art form of like, let's see where your body wants to take you and how we get there with some sort of principles involved?
I think it is very much like an evolving combination of the two, right? So there are absolutely underlying principles, factual principles you can't ignore. Like you can't just like make something up and then it changes how a bar reacts to gravity, right? You can't change biomechanics in the broadest sense. But certainly, very early on, I was doing things intuitively, almost exclusively, right? Because I didn't have the information. I wasn't reading the Soviet manuals and all these things and like doing all these calculations and figuring out my K value at the end of every set, all this mathematics and stuff like that. I was kind of figuring out like, this makes sense to me. This is working. This is what I do. And then kind of sort of towards the early middle of my career, I started getting more interested in that stuff. Like I was reading everything I could. I was trying to find out all this information, and like there's got to be more formulaic ways to write programs and to do these things. And then now I've come back out the other side where it's like, yeah, there's some of that stuff is valuable and it's good to kind of know and have it in your back pocket, but I really don't rely on it. Like still to this day, my programming, I would say, is much more on the intuitive side of things rather than having a spreadsheet with calculations that I'm basing everything off. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part, I don't find it to be the most effective way to do it. I do think there is way too much individual variation, especially with the kind of athletes I work with, which is everything from, a relatively young athlete who does virtually nothing but train for weightlifting to someone who's a little bit older, who has a full-time, real stressful career, and yet is still competing at the international level. You cannot train those two people the same way, no matter what the formula says. It is not possible. It doesn't work. But more importantly, I just don't enjoy it, right? If I wanted to be an accountant, I would have become an accountant. If I wanted to be a mathematician, that's what I would have done. If I wanted to be an engineer, that's what I would have done. I want to be a coach. And more importantly, I want to coach the way I want to coach. I want to coach the way that I find, pleasurable and meaningful and enjoyable, so that I'm not miserable, again, trying to achieve the outcome. I just need to get someone on an Olympic team, and it doesn't matter. I can be miserable and hate my life the whole time. As long as I get that thing, everything is going to work out great. I don't think that way. I'm in here in my office like, man, I just got to write some programs and get back to my athletes and help them get this stuff. And I'm going to do it in a way that is most effective within the parameters of being something I like doing and I can enjoy. And it's not that I worry that sounds like, oh, I'm not doing as well as I possibly could with, I could be doing more of these calculations and figuring out the exact numbers. That would be absolutely perfect. I'm saying I don't think that's a thing. I'm saying that you can rely on that stuff to an extent, and it's probably good early on in coaches' careers when they don't have all that accumulated experience that creates, intuition, which is, really just you unconsciously remembering your experience and what you learned. So I think that that's what appeals to me now and I'm in a position where I'm able to do that, right? I'm able to do things the way that I want to do them, to such a great extent, rather than being forced to do things in some way I find really unpleasant because I can't do it any other way.
Yeah, I think that speaks a lot to, if you have a strong foundation of understanding biomechanics and technique and numbers and percentages, that gives you the freedom to go play and have some fun. Like, okay, I understand some of these principles we more or less should abide by, but now I can go have fun and be the artist of how does this actually look for the individual athletes I work with. Because as soon as the human element comes in, some things get thrown out the window, even if they're true for others.
And, regarding the actual movement side of things, like you mentioned in your first question, it is absolutely a large degree of intuition and kind of artistry, as you would say. And I think the mistake that I made very early on, and most coaches make for at least some period of time in their careers, is trying to be too rigid in your prescriptions of movement, right? Or in anything really, being like wed to a very specific rule or method or whatever it is. And at this point now, I'm way more flexible with regard to how someone is doing something, as long as I can be assured that it is the most effective way for them in these circumstances, right? If I could take this person back 10 years and start over again and prevent this thing from ever happening, I probably would. But now we're, 15 years into a career. This thing's habit, and the amount of effort it's going to take and time to change it is going to be so much more disruptive than any potential minor change would be beneficial. So I'm going to leave it alone. And then, of course, that's when you get all the keyboard warriors who are like, well, why does your lifter do this? And, according to this lifter, their video, they said that it has to be this way. And it's like, well, I don't know. Why don't you ask her, when she's holding up her European Championship medal, like how she feels about it. So it's like, I think the point I'm getting at is I'm way more laid back now, where I'm like, previously my language was more like the lifter must do this. And now I'm like, yeah, you should probably do this. But, if you don't want to, I honestly don't care. If you're not my lifter, I don't care what you do. I don't care how you do it. I don't want to argue about it. The last thing I want to do is spend my limited time and energy arguing with some stranger on the internet about what is correct for the sport of weightlifting, or anything for that matter. It's bananas. And I used to get so irritated with that stuff, and now I'm just like, just laugh at the person and then move on with my life. And, everything stays totally fine. You don't have to address them.
I love the confidence, and then mixed in with that, just like, hey, I have a certain way I like doing things, and that's the way it's going to run. And it's going to attract the type of people who want to work with you and get coached in that way and develop that way. And so I appreciate just having a stance of like, this is where I'm at, this is where I want to go. And when you think back of all the years, you know, you've been in this thing, what are the things that still get you excited and get you fired up to keep showing up for your athletes and keep trying to create content and keep pushing the sport forward, if you will?
I mean, the thing that keeps me coaching, you know, through all the difficulties and the frustrations and stuff like that, is seeing one of my athletes succeed and seeing, you know, their emotional reaction to it. That's what matters to me, right? And so even if, and I know this sounds corny, but I mean, literally, even if it's a 1 kilo squat PR after like a really tough year or two, or, you know, it can be anything from that, or, you know, winning a national championship or breaking a national record, or, you know, making their first world team or whatever. It doesn't even matter exactly what the accomplishment is. It's more the effect it has on that person, and then my being able to share in that, knowing like I worked hard to help them get to something that has made them happy, right? And again, that sounds so corny. We can all hold hands now and sing Kumbaya, but you know what I mean? Like that's why I do it. Is it nice to kind of get the accolades as a coach and be able to say, well, I've done such and such, and yeah, it's nice, but the longer I do this, the more I recognize that it doesn't really matter. And, you know, like, for example, all of my international level competition lifters now are not American. And what that means is that they don't count toward my, say, like USA weightlifting coaching credentials. Like, those go nowhere now, because no matter how many of these people are on world teams and stuff, it makes no difference. USA weightlifting doesn't care. It's like they don't exist. And so, like, something like that used to bother me, but it's like, well, why does it matter? Number one, the 99% of the people who benefit from the content I'm putting out don't know anything about my coaching career. They couldn't name a single one of my lifters. They don't know what they've done. They don't know what I've done. It doesn't matter. All they care about is whether or not what I'm showing them is helping them get better. And as soon as I actually recognized that and accepted that as being the truth, my life got much better, because I got rid of this entire stress and this entire kind of looming thing that was worrying me. Like, oh God, you know, if I don't stay on top, and you know, my you know, US team isn't winning national championships still, like I'm going to be obsolete and no one's going to listen to me. It's like, well, they don't even know. They don't know. It doesn't matter anyway. And I don't want to live with that kind of pressure. I've spent my whole life like competing in one way or another. And so now as an athlete, I'm not competing anymore. As a coach, I don't want to feel that competition pressure. I want to help my lifters compete and compete the best they possibly can, but that's different. But, you know, I still have to compete as a business owner. So it's like, if I can knock some of that competition pressure off my list, it makes my life so much more enjoyable. And I can actually live my life versus like just constantly being wrapped up in this, the one-upmanship and the keeping up with the Coach Joneses, or, you know, whatever.
Yeah, it's really fun to hear. I would describe it as the clarity that you have now after all these years of coaching, of allowing curiosity and experiences and some of the artistry and sharing information and learning that have flowed to where you are now. And it's been super fun to get to hear not only your journey, but just where you're at and how you think about coaching and how that's impacted the athletes that you're with. I know, as a coach who's been in it for just a little bit, your videos have certainly helped me become a better coach and have taught me a lot, from how to move better to how to coach athletes better. So for that, very much grateful and appreciative of. For anybody who's out there who wants to connect with you, or, you know, learn more about what you're doing and how you help people live better, what are some of the best ways that they can connect with you?
Catalystathletics.com, the website, got every single thing I do related to weightlifting on there. Not to plug it too hard, but you will not find more free weightlifting resources anywhere in the universe. On Instagram is the social media I'm most active on, and that's Catalyst Athletics. I do have a YouTube channel. Basically, all I do is post the videos I have to make for Instagram. But I do have a really extensive exercise library, although I would go to the website for that because it's organized and easy to find, whereas YouTube is a giant mess. Good luck finding anything. That's pretty much it. That's what they, if you can find those two things, you can find everything else.
Yeah. And so I highly encourage you follow and check out those resources. Phenomenal books, not only in the Olympic weightlifting world, but also a great book about resilience and mental toughness called Tough. So certainly something to check out as well if you're interested. But Greg, I really appreciate your time. And this was super fun learning about your story and your journey and how that has unfolded to where you're at today. So appreciate the time you took to chat with me today.
Awesome. My pleasure.